In the 18th century, scientific and technological progress led to the Industrial Revolution. This was a time when mostly agrarian and rural communities changed into industrialized urban ones, especially in Europe and North America. With the invention of new machines and methods in textiles, iron production, and other fields, goods that were once made by hand began to be mass-produced in factories by machines. How long ago was the Industrial Revolution? Even though some inventions were made in the 1700s, the Industrial Revolution didn't really start until the 1830s and 1840s in Britain, and then it quickly spread to the rest of the world, including the United States. Modern historians often call this time period the First Industrial Revolution, not to confuse it with the second period of industrialization, which took place in the late 1800s and early 1900s and saw huge advances in the electric car and steel industries. The Spinning Jenny Time. Britain has been making linen, wool, and cotton for a long time, in part because its climate is damp and good for raising sheep. Before the Industrial Revolution, the British textile industry was more like a cottage industry, with individual weavers, spinners, and dyers working in small shops or even their own homes. Starting in the middle of the 18th century, inventions like the spinning jenny, which is a wooden frame with many spindles, the water frame, the flying shuttle, and the power loom made it easier to weave cloth and spin yarn and thread. Cloth production got faster, so it took less time and a lot less work from people. Because there were more efficient and used machines, Britain's new textile mills were able to meet the growing demand for cloth both at home and in many overseas colonies that were part of the British Empire. The British iron industry, like the textile industry, took advantage of new technologies. One of the new ways to melt iron ore was to use coke instead of the old method of using charcoal. This technology made materials that were both cheaper and of higher quality. This made it possible for Britain to increase its iron and steel production in response to the demand caused by the Napoleonic Wars and later the growth of the railroad industry. How steam power changed things. Thomas Newcomen became a symbol of the Industrial Revolution when he built the first modern steam engine's prototype in the early 1700s. The atmospheric steam engine, which was Newcomen's idea, was first used to power machines that pumped water out of mine shafts. In the 1760s, the Scottish engineer James Watt started using one of Newcomen's versions. He added a separate water condenser, which made it more efficient. Watt later worked with Matthew Boulton to make a rotary motion steam engine. This made it possible for steam power to be used in many British industries, such as cotton mills, waterworks, canals, and distilleries. With the help of steam power and steam engines, miners could dig deeper and get more of this cheap energy source. During and after the Industrial Revolution, the need for coal grew because it was used to power factories that made goods as well as the railroads and steamships that moved them. Transportation was a big issue during the Industrial Revolution. Before industrialization, Britain's roads were not very good, but they quickly got better. By 1815, the whole country had more than 2,000 miles of canals. Richard Trevithick made a steam-powered locomotive in the early 1800s. By 1830, similar locomotives were moving freight and people between Liverpool and Manchester, which were both important industrial centers. At the time, boats and ships powered by steam were already very common. They were used to move goods along Britain's rivers and canals and across the Atlantic. Banking and communication during the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith, a Scottish social philosopher who's often called the father of modern economics, published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Smith wanted an economic system with free business, private ownership of the means of production, and very little government interference. During this time, banks and industrial financiers became more important, as did an ownership and management system for making things. In the 1770s, the London Stock Exchange opened, and in the early 1790s, the New York Stock Exchange did the same. Toward the end of the Industrial Revolution, people realized they needed better ways to talk to each other over long distances. At the same time, communication technology was making big leaps forward. Even though Samuel Morse and other American inventors were working on their own versions, the first commercial telegraph system was patented in 1837 by British inventors Charles Wheatstone and William Cooke. The way they did things would be used for railroad signaling because the faster steam-powered trains needed more complex ways to talk to each other. Workers' movement brought about incredible changes in the society. Before the Industrial Revolution, many people in Britain started moving from the countryside to the cities. This trend grew a lot stronger during the Industrial Revolution as the growth of huge factories turned small towns into major cities over time. This rapid urbanization caused a lot of problems like poor sanitation, pollution, a lack of safe drinking water in overcrowded cities, and bad living conditions. While industrialization raised the standard of living for the middle and upper classes and boosted the economy as a whole, the poor and working classes continued to struggle. As technology improved, working in factories became more boring and sometimes dangerous, and many people, including children, were forced to work long hours for pitifully low pay. Because of these changes and abuses, people all over the world were against industrialization. Outrage over poor working and living conditions would lead to the creation of labor unions and the passing of new child labor laws and public health regulations in both the United States and the United Kingdom over the next few decades. These changes were made to help the working class and poor people whose lives had been hurt by industrialization. How the Industrial Revolution changed things. Today, life is simpler. Since the last century, most of our daily lives have drastically changed, from canals and roads that make transit faster and cell phones that make communication easier. Industrialization caused these modifications. The 18th century Industrial Revolution transformed agriculture, industry, mining, communication, and transportation. Land, labor, capital, colonial empire, and laissez-faire shaped the Industrial Revolution. Laborers are farmers and peasants who labor for wages. When the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain, hundreds of people moved to the city for work in factories, as we said earlier in this video. Steam-powered machines simplified work. Instead of hefty hand-doing everything, machines did most of the work and simply needed people to set it off at each checkpoint. Manufacturing was simplified by crop rotation. Employers needed low-wage workers due to these changes. They found that children and women worked as well as males for lower wages and longer hours. Hundreds of laborers worked long hours in a confined area with few breaks. They had to adapt to the weather conditions and the machines. Production costs determined wages. Owners cut pay if land and capital prices rose. Over time, child labor was banned as well. Natural resources such as land were crucial to the Industrial Revolution. Britain has plentiful iron and coal ores. Machines required iron and coal, which were in high demand. Due to iron's inability to endure steam pressure, the industry needed a new metal to build equipment. Purified iron, steel, met this demand. The Bessemer process, invented by Englishmen William Kelly and Henry Bessemer, was cheap and efficient. Bessemer forced air through molten metal to burn out carbon and other impurities that rendered it brittle. Wind and water were used during the Industrial Revolution. Windmills were powered by wind like water mills. Both had one drawback. Wind was not always available, and the water pressure required a factory to be near a stream or river. Water-powered steam engines sped transportation. Steam engines were much faster, cheaper, and safer than roadways. Converting water to steam and using its movement to generate electricity was a common method. A person or business capital, money or property, was invested to make money. England's commercial revolution was based on land. Land investments increased capital. Parliament's enclosure regulations of the 18th century allowed tenants' farmers' common fields to be enclosed into big private farms with a reduced labor force. The Industrial Revolution increased machine-made items. Financiers and banks helped the revolution develop by handling more money. Industrialists received short-term loans from banks for machinery. Industrialists may acquire new machinery and grow their enterprise with their own money. Industrialists needed short-term cash to acquire raw materials and pay labor, and long-term capital to expand. Their investment in new ventures accelerated the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution created a middle class. Bankers, merchants, manufacturers, doctors, professors, lawyers, and engineers were middle class. Compared to the middle class, the working class struggled economically. However, the middle class gained reputation and distinction by eating properly, hiring servants, and enjoying comfort. Because of this, aristocratic governments sought the support of middle-class economists because they feared industry would alter radically. As aristocracy declined in English governance and society, people's values changed. Due to the fixed amount of money in the world, mercantilism, one country taking riches from another, became the most significant value. Laissez-faire dominated the Industrial Revolution. Laissez-faire meant let do or let alone in French. The success of many new factories and firms in the Industrial Revolution made their owners rich. This created the factory-owning bourgeoisie class. Long hours, poor conditions, and child labor resulted without government intervention. Later in the Industrial Revolution, the government enforced child labor and working conditions rules. Industrialization affected our life in many ways. better communication, faster transit, and more. We have sophisticated necessities and fair working wage and child labor rules. Industrialization made life easier. That was all from our side. Stay tuned for more.